Good day, climate fans, and welcome to the National Climate League's Brunch and Learn series. Today, we welcome Luc Gagnon to speak on public transportation, making intelligent investments, given the context that we are currently in, where the government is going to be injecting a ton of money into the economy to restart it. How do we do that in an intelligent way, in a way that responds not only to the economic crisis that we're facing, but also the ecological crisis and also public transit needs? So today's presentation is one of a series of webinars that you can find at hubflix.climatehub.ca, an initiative led by the Climate Reality Project of Canada, of which I am the National Campaign Manager. And I'm joined by my colleagues today, the NCL Commissioner, Natalie Richards. Good afternoon, Natalie. And the comms coordinator for Climate Reality Canada, Sofia Vedechkina. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. Good morning and afternoon to some of you. And of course, Luc Gagnon will be presenting our expert in life cycle analysis and public transit investments. So without further ado, I'll give you just a quick brief overview of Climate Reality's mission, and then we'll jump into Luc's presentation. Climate Reality Canada is an 11-year-old organization whose objective is to accelerate climate action in Canada, reducing emissions while maintaining excellent quality of life, doing so in an equitable manner. And we hold, typically in a normal year, several in-person trainings with Al Gore, where he gives presentations to 1,000 or 2,000 people in large convention centers. Unfortunately, this year, all 5 trainings are very likely to be canceled. The first 3 have been canceled due to the coronavirus pandemic. And so much of our programming will be moving online henceforth, and this is one of the evidences of that. So with that in mind, Climate Reality supports local climate activists in their communities across the country through the Climate Hub initiative, and we encourage folks to take the information they're using on today's call, on today's webinar, and use it in their communities. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Luc Gagnon, the former president of Transport 2000, or Transportation Trajectoire Quebec, pardon me, is what it's now referred to as. And sorry, I'm only finding your French bio, so I'm going to read it as best I can in English. Luc has worked for many years, from 1992 to 2011, as a principal consultant for climate change at Hydro-Quebec. He was the president of Trajectoire Quebec, at the time Transport 2000, from 2009 to 2010, and has taught for several years at the École de Technologie Supérieure in Montreal, Sustainable Development and Life Cycle Analysis. He is also one of the expert advisors to the international intergovernmental panel on climate change, and provides feedback to their assessment report cycles. His analysis of public transit projects are frequently published in Quebec media, and he has been an advisor for one of the climate hubs in our network, the Montreal Climate Coalition, since the coalition's creation in 2015. So without further ado, I will pass the mic over to Luc. You are most welcome to pose questions during the presentation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And some of you already sent some questions in ahead of the presentation, so those will be addressed after Luc's presentation as well. Given that we're started about 5 minutes late, likelihood is that we'll end about 5 minutes later as well. So thanks all for joining us, and Luc, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthew. It's a pleasure to be sharing all of this information. Oops. As you will see from my presentation, basically looking at life cycle assessment is very useful, very integral part to having good solution, but sometimes it's not so fun because we tend to bring back people on the ground on some of the issues. For example, I'll be talking about the regular bus networks and how they fare compared to other options. Oops, just the first little thing is maybe if you miss some of the screen, it's not an issue. Just to remind us why public transit is so important is because the social and public costs of cars are huge. And what I did here is a study a few years back on the cost of roads, free parking, police, firefighters, accident costs, and all the issues that are actually public costs of cars. And at that time, I was at about $3,600 per car. And if you look in Quebec, and actually it's Montreal area, road congestion costs are around $3,000 per car per year. So these are huge costs. And what's important to see is the cost of air pollutant, which is large, and even GHG, but they're actually quite small if you compare the overall cost. For example, is one of the issue I've been raising, and some people don't like me for that, is like, do cars make a big difference? And they don't reduce congestion, they won't reduce the cost of roads and parking, they don't reduce car. Yes, they will reduce air pollution in the future, but air pollution is only 7% of public and social costs. So, and what that means is that all these subsidies are creating the problem in a sense by making car essential, by creating urban sprawl. For 2020, we can estimate the auto subsidies at about $4,000 per vehicle a year for an average car that does 15,000 a year. But in reality, if you look at some of the extreme cases, if you take a suburban household with 2 cars and doing 30,000 kilometers per year, it's equivalent to a subsidy of about $16,000 per year per household. So it's quite easy to understand why there is urban sprawl. It's not being critical to people. It's just actually, it's an intelligent choice to choose low density sprawl because you're being subsidized very much. There's consensus now on the fact that urban sprawl is a big cost, but what is sometimes forgotten, which will be an issue in the presentation, the main reason why public transit is costly is because of the low density sprawl. So this is all related, all these issues are. So now the main features of the presentation is comparing which mode are the best public transit modes. In fact, it's important to understand that there's no ideal mode. It's always a matter of adapting the capacity, the choice of mode to the expected level of demand. So I often talk about the right mode in the right place. What are the costs? Metro and SkyTrain extensions, this is the first myth because everybody wants Metro, and even in Quebec, there's still a lot of extensions. If you look at the cost, I mean, it's not a small difference. If you compare a tram with the Metro, it's 10 times more expensive to build the Metro. And if you look at the Blue Line extension, which has been recently approved, it's $800 million per kilometer of line. It's so expensive. Why do politicians prefer that? Because they do not, Metro extensions do not displease motorists. And what is happening in Quebec is exactly the REM project and so on is there's been so much emphasis on metro only that we have very little project, actually one project every 10 years. And now the government was so desperate that they rely on private development for the REM. So obviously we have to change that trend. Metro, SkyTrain are not the way to go.
Luke, just to let you know, when you speak a little bit quieter, your mic cuts out.
I'll move forward.
Thanks.
One important thing, because in Quebec, we get a lot of confusion of what's happening in the rest of Canada and in the same way in both directions. And it's important to realize that the French classification of transit modes are a bit different than the usual English classification. In English, we often use light rail transit, but actually that expression includes like many different things, like suburban trains, modern, SkyTrain, which is actually always going on the equivalent of an overpass, and the urban tram, which goes on the ground. So I'll be using the French classification because if I use the light rail transit classification, it's very difficult to distinguish the modes. The right mode in the right place, what you see in the middle column, I think is the key. It's like what is normal ridership per day. And Metro have large capacity. In Montreal, you even have some very extreme cases, the Orange Line, which has 400,000 users per day. What is key here is understanding like the recent project, the SkyTrain. It's the same capacity as a big tram, and it's 5 times more expensive than a tram for the same capacity. So fact is Metro and SkyTrain are often too expensive. Doesn't mean that there should never be any other metro station. For example, you can, in Montreal, I think a good more stations to go to Bois, which is just a small extension, sort of complete the network and have intermodal stations. Another myth, which is quite strong here, maybe not as strong in other parts of Canada, is like the bus has a good choice for major networks. If you look at the normal capacity of a bus line, what we're doing in Montreal, you have many STM bus lines that are 35,000 users per day, which is like 2 or 3 times what would be normal. So what's happening in Montreal is we're doing with buses what most other major cities are doing with trams. And one example of that, well, if you have questions on that, is a bit controversial, but the Ottawa project, it had 2 very big bus lines with very serious problem, mostly in winter, and they are replacing that with a very big tram also. So for Montreal, you can see, do we develop a right mode in the right place? No, absolutely not, because, for example, the Metro Blue Line has an expected ridership, which is similar to the bus rapid transit on P9, and one costs 4.5 billion and the other one 400 million. And bus rapid transit will actually be very poor quality service because there's just too many people that will be on these buses. So another myth that is related to buses is like, I use data for hybrid diesel buses because it's better than just diesel buses. But when we often look at buses, people assume that they produce significant reduction in greenhouse gases. In fact, they do not most of the time. The only place probably in Canada where the regular buses reduce greenhouse gas emissions are on the big STM lines, because these have a very high level of ridership and load compared to any other bus route. Look,
Yeah, you're cutting out pretty significantly. So maybe I think if you speak a little bit louder, your microphone won't clip.
okay, so look at the on the right hand side, that is the life cycle. It's important that you understand that some people will question these figures because they are used to looking at only the direct emissions from buses and cars. So this is life cycle data that comes from a whole bunch of publications. And if you look, for example, the typical urban bus will emit per passenger kilometer the same level as a small hybrid car. And if you look at, for example, and these are cars with only the driver, so carpooling would have a better performance than just about any bus route in Canada. In contrast, if you go down and look at trams and other options, that means very, very serious reductions in greenhouse gas emissions compared to regular buses. This leads us to the question, and because there's, I think some people are understand now that buses don't reduce emissions, so they go and look at battery-powered electric buses to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, but this is a bit complicated issue because it depends from a life cycle perspective on the production of batteries, kilometers travel, capacity of buses, and the source of electricity that. So just to, this is a bit technical, but it's important to understand that the energy density of even the best batteries is very small compared to regular fuel. So fortunately, the electric motor is 4 or 5 times more efficient than the internal combustion engine, but it still means that for every kilogram of battery, a kilogram of fuel is still 9 times better as far as how much weight you have to carry. So the issue is really the battery production, I'm coming to that, but also the weight of the bus. For example, if we look at the buses, the electric buses that are being bought now, the few of them in Montreal, they have 8 times more batteries than the regular electric cars, and the GHG emission for producing the batteries of a car is about 9 tons. So you can understand, it means that just producing the batteries of electric buses is about 72 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. What I did to really put that in perspective is how many years to offset the emissions from battery production. And for cars, since in general, we don't use cars for such, what I did is I used the regular distances, about 15,000 kilometers for a car, which means that if a small Chevrolet Bolt replaces a Honda Civic, the electricity from hydro, it will take 3 to 4 years to offset the greenhouse gas emissions from battery production. For an electric bus, fortunately, since the distance is so large compared to a car, it will take about 1 year in Quebec, but if you're in Ontario and the electricity comes from natural gas, it still takes 2 years for the electric bus to offset its own emissions from battery manufacture. The other issue is that, like, that's why I was talking of the energy density of batteries. The batteries in a bus are about 5 tons, which is a weight equivalent to 70 passengers. So that's the normal capacity of a bus. So you understand that because of that constraint, an electric bus will always have a smaller capacity in terms of passenger than a regular bus. So overall, if you take factoring all these issues, the cost of electric buses are about 2-3 times more expensive than diesel hybrid buses. But still, if we come back to greenhouse gas emissions, I think they are justified if the electricity is clean, not from coal. But again, the issue is the right mode in the right place, is because another myth that we've been seeing, not only in Quebec, but many people now say that we don't need trams because electric buses can replace them. That's not, well, it would be true if it would be a very, very small tram, but most of the time tram routes are make sense because they have the possibility of high capacity. And if you look at the various tram set for trams, you can see that their capacity can be 8 times bigger than electric buses. So it's obvious that battery-powered electric buses don't have sufficient capacity for major networks.
Just to flag the time, we'd like to wrap up in about 10 minutes. So to leave some time for questions, maybe another 2 or 3 minutes.
Yes,
Great.
near the end, fine. So coming back to the issue of urban sprawl, is if we look at trams replacing replacing buses, it's justified to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But the main benefit of tram networks is not that. It is the fact that it will increase the density of cities and it will avoid urban sprawl. So this is the main issue why I've been promoting trams for the last years or so on. And it's quite clear that bus routes actually don't development. They are polluting and they don't really create the conditions where people want to build, for example, higher density residential or buildings. So why do tram network increase the density of cities in contrast with buses? It's quite obvious. It's permanent, it's quieter, it's less polluting, more reliable, and it avoids a lot of road congestion, especially in dense neighborhoods. So all of that is like an obvious benefit for me, an obvious option when it comes to all medium density neighborhoods. Unfortunately, we're not doing that in Montreal, but there are good trends in Toronto. The tram development is now a global trend. In France, there's 70 networks where more than 1,300 tram stations, 400 tram lines in the world. And in Canada, recent projects in Toronto, Ottawa, Kitchener. So I think that we are going in the right direction, but we need to speed up very significantly that trend. That's it for me now. I'll be taking questions.
Great, thank you so much, Luc. To follow up on your last comment there, well, and a few other things that you've mentioned throughout. So you're a big advocate of trams. One of the first points that you made about why some cities tend to move towards subway and metro and underground forms of public transit is because of the conflict that that public transit on the road can cause with other road users. So trams are on the road as well. Do you typically see conflict between in cities where they're using more tram style forms of public transit with road users?
Well, in theory, yes, there is a conflict because the tram is on the road, but if you look at the real life where you build a tram line, normally it's a place where you always have very numerous buses and also a lot of cars. So if you compare the fact that trams will increase public transit, overall, the effect on congestion would be a major reduction. In France, they've observed that just replacing the buses with the tram, there's an immediate increase of about 30% in ridership in public transit. And if you add the long-term effect, the increase are a lot bigger also. So overall, if you replace a lot of cars, you reduce congestion.
And I had another question on my list that one of our viewers has also just asked. So maybe I'll follow up with this. If a city such as, say, Montreal, for example, who already has a fairly integrated bus network, but not a tram network, and then for other cities, maybe like smaller cities that don't have tram networks, would you still recommend that they implement, even if they're kind of starting from zero, that they implement a tram network over a bus network?
Well, you need a minimum sort of ridership. If you look in France, they are building many tram lines for 15,000 users per day. So that's not very big, and there's a lot of bus networks with that kind of figures. So there's a possibility, maybe we don't need to do it at that level yet, because if, like I mentioned, the number of bus routes in many cities in Canada that have 20 and 30,000 riders per day, that could keep us busy with new tram networks for a long time.
Mm-hmm. And what about smaller cities that maybe lack the density and the levels of ridership that create economies of scale for larger cities? What would you recommend for cities like that? For example, I'm living in one of the suburbs of Toronto right now. We have a very limited bus network that most people can't rely on. But it's a small city under, I think, 200,000 people. So yeah, what approach would you recommend for cities like that?
Well, like I mentioned, the electric buses, especially if you're in you want to build a network that will not have a big ridership, electric buses are perfect for that. And what my data also shows, which is not so popular, but carpooling is still a very efficient option if it can be used in a more organized way, so that people can sort of build around that. It's not just a once in a while option. So if you go to low density, I would say carpooling and electric buses are the two options.
Would you, I'm thinking of, in terms of the processes and processes of planning and implementation of new or improved public transit systems, do you have any recommendations for municipalities that are looking to increase the inclusivity of those processes?
Well, if the case of Montreal is important, is we have a big problem with really, let's come back. Whenever you are building something, normally what you do is you have strategic planning. This is a step where you look at the options, you document them, and you have a public consultation on these options. And this is how you should be doing things, and it's not going that way in Montreal or in Quebec. It's a bit like that in Toronto, but I think it's not that good, because when Toronto decided to build what they call their big move, they did the strategic planning, consultation, and so on, and then various mayors and prime ministers came, and premiers came, and they changed what was actually a very good plan. But what it shows is that, like any other business, if you do the strategic planning and you consult, you will get the best options on the ground. But there is no, in many cases, there is no strategic planning at all.
Sorry, I've got just one, I think we've got time for about one more question. So are there any tips that you would share, for example, with viewers tuning in with us today, and in the future visiting this webinar? What tips would you recommend for people who want to encourage their municipal decision makers to improve their local public transit? I'm sure that answer will differ depending on the type of community that someone's living in.
Yes, but I'd say my answer is quite universal. The big problem we have now is electric cars. I mean, politicians, they want to have that kind of options where they can tell people, well, we will solve everything with one option and you don't have to make any sacrifice and we don't need public transit. If we're not ready to be very clear that electric cars will not change our urban development, it will not reduce significantly our greenhouse gas emissions. What we need is more density and more trams or metro where it's justified. If we're not ready to question electric cars, I mean, we will get nowhere, because that's the very easy solution for politicians.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything specific that residents could be asking their municipal decision makers to do then?
Well, if you look at the overall development of public transit, I think that the numerous smaller municipalities have a say in asking their more central government to have the strategic planning on development, and that's what they can do. And as far as also municipal governments, if they stop asking for more roads, well, that would be a great help also, because if people still think that we need more roads, obviously they're still in maybe in the mindset that was there 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Luc. I believe Sophia has a few things to share with us.
I'll conclude, but could I ask Luc to push the little red button to stop sharing his screen, and that way I'll be able to share mine. Superb, thank you. And okay, just a quick note on the next two webinars coming up. I have a visual here for the first of those two. It is in French about natural infrastructure, and it will feature Sylvain Perron of the David Suzuki Foundation, and that is on the 17th of April at 12:30 in the afternoon. The following webinar will be the 8th of May at 11:30. So all the English webinars happening at 11:30 and all the French ones happening at 12:30. And the 8th of May will feature, sorry, the 12th the 8th, pardon me, yes, of May will feature Jason, his name is close. Jason of the Clean Air Partnership, anyways. And sorry, Kevin Behan of the Clean Air Partnership will be speaking about investments to improve air quality. So again, looking at investments in how we can turn this crisis into a launching pad for a more sustainable economy and a more equitable economy. So thank you very much for joining us. And we hope that you have downloaded the NCL standings and will be able to use some of that data and some of those recommendations that are in that document as well in your municipalities. So some of the questions that were asked on today's webinar will also be answered in that document. And the link to download it is ncl.climatehub.ca. I will post it in the chat here. And if you're watching on YouTube later on, you'll be able to see it in the notes below this video. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. And thank you especially to Luc Gagnon for taking the time this afternoon.
Thank you.